So, I guess with that, shall we start with an introduction into the different mechanisms or the different ways that we can react to foods? Because often, obviously, the common terms are an intolerance, a sensitivity, an allergy at the most fundamental level, and those terms are often obviously used inappropriately as it is. So do you want to start with the different ways that we can react to food?
Sure, that's a really great question. And in and of itself, a long answer. Okay, so you've already said that there are food sensitivities, food intolerances, and food allergies. And that's the kind of medical classification, I guess. It's the labeling of how we react to food, immunologically speaking. So your immune system has lots of different branches to it. So in the same way that the defense force of a country has the Navy, the Air Force, and the Army, for example, and you can't send a submarine to do something that you need a helicopter to do. Your immune system also has several different branches, and those branches, in this instance that I'm talking about, are characterized by what kind of antibody they make. So an allergy, a true allergy, is characterized by an IgE antibody reaction. It's very fast, and it can be fatal. It's often accompanied by something like anaphylaxis, where the throat swells, or it's considered to be severe, and it's a that is allergy. That is how we define allergy. And so if you have celiac disease and you're having an immunological reaction to gluten, that's not an allergic reaction. It's a different part of the immune system that's responding. It's not an allergy, even though it's often called an allergy. So then you have an intolerance. And an intolerance is usually defined by an issue in the gut. So, for example, lactose intolerance means that you have inadequate levels of, or you don't have enough lactase, which is an enzyme required for digestion of lactose, which is a sugar, and that will lead you to symptoms, right? So it's digestive, it's not immune-mediated, and that is, I think, generally understood to be the definition of intolerance. And then you've got sensitivity, or inflammatory reactions to foods, and you've sort of got autoimmune reactions to foods. And so in this instance, we're looking at immune reactions again, and we're looking at IgG reactions or IgA reactions. So in celiac disease, that is the body making an IgA antibody to gluten, and a corresponding IgA antibody to an enzyme on the gut wall. And IgA secretory IgA specifically, is the most abundant immune chemical, I suppose, or immune cell in the body, especially in the gut, right? We have secretory IgA that lives on the gut wall and is very involved in the immune system of the gut, so intolerance and also in loss of tolerance to proteins. And we can talk about what is tolerance in the first place and why is that important to understand with autoimmune disease and food reactions. And IgG is kind of the backup to that. So IgA and IgG are actually fairly similar to each other in structure compared to, let's say, IgM, which is very big. And they back each other up. So in celiac, one of the things that's common in celiac disease is something called IgA insufficiency. And in that case, you'll be making IgG antibodies to gluten and having the same immune reaction as a result of that, but it's IgG mediated instead of IgA mediated. So they have a close relationship, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. Okay. But medically speaking, they're also quite distinct and quite different than each other. IgG is actually the most abundant immunoglobulin found in the blood, whereas IgA is the most abundant on the gut wall. So that's where we see sensitivities and inflammatory reactions to foods. And with IgG reactions, they can come and go. So they might be because you've overexposed your gut to a specific protein, or because your gut is inflamed, and it might be temporary. So you can restore IgA reactions or IgA tolerance much more easily than if you're having an IgA reaction to a food. Yeah, that's probably my best definition of like that aspect of things. But on top of that, there are lots of ways that you can have inflammatory reactions to foods. Okay, so I've just described the immune reactions that you can have plus lactose intolerance. But food can be generally pro-inflammatory. So, for example, sugar is inflammatory in everybody. Vegetable oils and damaged fats and, trans fats are pro-inflammatory in everybody. A can of Coke is inflammatory in everybody. These are just foods that are generally inflammatory. And then you can be having specific inflammatory reactions. So they're specific to you and your body. And they are the ones that are immune-mediated or because you have a specific malfunction. So they could be considered your trigger from an autoimmune perspective. And then you've got inflammatory reactions that are gut-mediated. So they are happening not because there's an issue directly with your immune system, but because there is an issue in the gut. When humans eat food, we make byproducts. Okay, so we make urine and we make stool. And when bacteria eat food, when the bacteria in our gut eat the food that we eat, they also have byproducts of bacterial digestion. So some of those things are considered to be beneficial. Bacteria make short-chain fatty acids, which help us to modulate inflammatory reactions in the gut. They help us to have a healthy gut wall, for example, but they can also be pro-inflammatory. So I know that you spoke to Tracy Randall about SIBO. And SIBO is probably a really good example of when the bacterial byproducts or metabolites cause significant problems, right? So in that instance, I think you guys spoke about hydrogen and methane and hydrogen sulfide, but there is actually a really long list of microbial metabolites that can cause systemic inflammatory symptoms. So hydrogen sulfide, for example, is a mitochondrial toxin that is something like 100 times more toxic to the mitochondria than cyanide.
Wow.
And you make things that are called things that are obviously problematic. Okay, your bacteria can make cadaverine and putrescine and alcohols and aldehydes and things like that that are pretty toxic to the system. So in all of those instances, those are inflammatory. So you're having inflammatory reactions directly related to the foods that you're eating, but they're not general. They won't be happening in everybody, right? They're happening specific to you, and they're not immune-mediated. So they're not triggering a direct antibody response. Then as an extra layer on top of that, some people react to specific compounds in food. So they might be reacting to histamine, or they might be reacting to oxalates, or they might be reacting to salicylates in food. Again, that tends to be because there's a mechanistic issue with the body, right? It might be because there's an imbalance in the gut bacteria. It might be because there's an issue with the kidneys, or it might be because there is a lack of nutrients involved. You might not have enough magnesium or calcium or vitamin A, vitamin D, something like that, that has led to there being issues. And the downstream consequence of that is that you're now not tolerating chemicals in foods, even naturally occurring chemicals in foods, and that's causing problems in your body. So food as it pertains to chronic health is multifactorial. There's a lot of pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, and therefore just taking gluten out of the diet or just taking dairy out of the diet or that kind of thing is often can make a very big difference, let me say that, but often not enough. You have to really get into the nuances of individual personal, what do they call that? A biochemical individuality, right? For each person, it's going to be a few things to think about and a few layers that might need to be in place to identify what the problem is and to restore it. Because one man's meat is another man's poison, but also food is the most powerful medicine that we have. So I think those two side-by-side sayings that we have are both true.
Yeah, and I think one man's poison is the same man's food later on.
Yeah, there's also that. Your needs change a lot as your biochemistry changes. When you're working through a program, what really doesn't work for you now might be the very thing that helps you to restore your health in 6 months' time or in 18 months' time. It's a moving target, which of course also makes things a bit more complicated. Especially if you're trying to do this yourself at home with Dr. Google, which so many of my patients are, because they've failed to get answers conventionally and they've just taken on the responsibility themselves and they're doing this all from the internet.
Yeah. And there must be a I guess a spectrum, and all I mean by that is I see that my most chronic / acute clients are often the ones with oxalate, salicylate, histamine issues. So with that, with all those different layers of how we can react to food, would you like to attempt to I guess lay out your thoughts, and how would we then start going about trying to personalize this in regards to understanding what are some of the mechanisms that people are reacting to, and how do we go about supporting a person through this? Do you have your own kind of, I guess, sequence almost, as if I use the term?
Yeah. So again, that's a really good question, because often in the beginning the water is really muddy. You know, it is very difficult when somebody is in that acute chronic stage and everything is inflamed, and like the digestive domino is what I call it, where there's not enough stomach acid, there's SIBO, there's inflammation, there's problems with the bile, you know, the gut is kind of a mess, the system is inflamed, in that person, it is very difficult in the beginning especially to identify what is actually having what reaction. You know, the inflammatory reactions are so established that it takes a little while to bring them down enough to be able to really recognize cause and effect. So, you know, my system of thinking is, first of all, you have to identify if there's issues in the gut or not. And you also need to identify if there are specific immune reactions happening to the foods. That's kind of the first two things that I think about. And if there are problems in the gut, then you probably need to start there first. So if, for example, you were budget restricted and you could only do one test, right? I would always start with a gut focus test of some kind, either stool analysis or organic and amino acids, depending on the context, because gut reactions are going to determine whether or not somebody is going to eat a food at the end of the day. And if you can calm down the gut first and then work out what's going on with the immune system, that just tends to be the way that I work in my practice. It's, you know, I do adjust things because it is complicated, right? So I personalize everything for everybody. That's probably my sequential order of implementation, I would say.
Yeah.
But you find out things as you go along. You can't test for everything. So it depends on which test you're going to choose. You know, one organic acid test tests for oxalates, another one doesn't. Salicylates you might not work out for a little while because you have to bring down the primary inflammation level a little bit first to even understand that someone's having a response to salicylates. I don't use a salicylate test in my clinic. I don't know if there is one.
No, I'm not sure.
No, so that's, for understanding that someone's having an issue with histamine or salicylates might not be something that's even obvious in the beginning. It comes when you've done a few months of work and calmed down some of the general inflammation and some of what's going on in the gut. And people can be having really big immune-mediated reactions to food without there being big problems in the gut as well. Like once oral tolerance is broken, and oral tolerance might not be broken by something that's gone on in the gut, right? Oral tolerance can be broken because chemical tolerance is broken, for example, or because there's an infection. So it might not be immediately obvious that there is a raft of inflammatory reactions to foods because there's no gut symptoms, even though that person has developed autoimmune disease kind of thing. So it's not always obvious, yeah.
So oral tolerance, I'm pretty sure we mentioned that in our first episode together around the immune system being non-responsive to our food and to our bacteria in the gut. And you just mentioned their chemical tolerance. So can you just touch on what you mean by that?
Yeah, so there are lots of different, there are several different types of tolerance that the body has, but the basic definition of tolerance is literally that your immune system has chosen not to respond to non-self, so something in the environment which is now in the body. And there are several different things that your immune system can choose to respond to or not to respond to. So chemicals are one of those, infections are another one, and foods. There are all things that come into the body that the immune system has to decide that they're either going to react to or not react to. So each of those has its own name: food protein tolerance, chemical tolerance, central tolerance, peripheral tolerance, and oral tolerance are the three tolerance mechanisms in the body. And then you've got these other sort of categories within that related to the compound that the immune system is reacting to, yes or no. But the thing about tolerance is that once you've broken tolerance in one area, tolerance is an immune system feature, and your immune system is global in the body. Like each local area of immunity is connected to every other local area of immunity via chemical messengers. So once you've broken tolerance in one area, it's really easy to break tolerance in a separate area as well, because it's the same immune mechanism globally, or it's at the very least closely related.
Okay.
And with autoimmune disease, you've sort of taken that one step further, because the immune system has now lost tolerance to the body itself. It's lost tolerance to a specific tissue in the body. And that is almost 100% of the time preceded by loss of tolerance, loss of oral tolerance, loss of chemical tolerance. There's usually some other mechanism. That doesn't just happen spontaneously and for no reason. So we talked a little bit about the protein has to look different, like the tissue itself has to look different to the body. For the immune system, has to look different to the immune system for that loss of tolerance to self tissue to occur. But that is often preceded by there being a chemical involved, or an infection involved, or a food reaction involved. So loss of oral tolerance. Let me talk to you about that a little bit. So we develop oral tolerance as part of developing our immune system when we're born. And there is a sequence of events that occurs in the gut as part of healthy tolerance. So you have special tissues, a bit like a trapdoor, in the gut wall, called your GALT, gut-associated lymphoid tissue. And then you have special immune cells called your dendritic cells. And dendritic cells look like Mr. Tickle, right? They're an immune cell with long arms, and they basically are able to reach into the gut and to pick up samples of food proteins, and they carry that into your lymphatic system, and they kind of show it to your immune system. So your dendritic cell is an antigen presenting cell. It presents the food to your immune system in order to set up tolerance or reaction messages. So inside your lymph, you have regulatory T cells. And we did talk in the last webinar about the different branches of T cells. Regulatory T cells are the part of the immune system that determine tolerance mechanisms, essentially. So you want to stimulate regulatory T cells because they're your tolerance cells. So when the dendritic cell shows the food to the Treg cell, that should send the message: tolerate this. This is okay. Everything's fine. This food is a good guy. Nothing to see here. Move along. And though liver function is also involved in that. So in your liver, you have specific cells called the Kupffer cells. I think I'm pronouncing that right. I've never heard it spoken. I've only ever read it. And Kupffer cells can actually influence immunological reactions or inflammatory reactions to the proteins that are being sampled by the dendritic cells. So if your liver is particularly stressed out, if you've got a big toxic burden, if you're not dealing very well with things that are going on in the environment, or it's got an inflammatory issue, if you've got an Epstein-Barr virus that's causing problems in the liver, for example, or some kind of a cirrhosis, and your liver is inflamed, then you are more likely to have an inflammatory response to the food that's being sampled by the dendrites.
Okay.
So the liver's also involved there. In the gut specifically, in order to achieve or to maintain oral tolerance, you need to have good secretory IgA, because that is the immune cell that's most prevalent in the gut. And low secretory IgA actually means that your dendritic cells become more activated because the dendritic cells are attempting to counteract they're trying to do the job of the secretory IgA. Secretory IgA can't do its job properly because it's low. So dendrites try to sort of step in and help out with its jobs. And in doing that, it becomes overactive. And so then when it's also picking up the food proteins, it's much more likely to have an inflammatory response or an inflammatory signal associated with that food. And things that compromise secretory IgA in the gut include infections such as Candida, for example. So yeasts actually make an enzyme that I think it's literally called secretory IgA A's or something like that. It's got a very intuitive name to it. So it can be infection, it can be steroids, for example, it can be stress, it can be vitamin A deficiency, chronic viral or bacterial infections. All of those things can reduce the level of secretory IgA, which makes the dendrites overactive, which can lead to food reactions. And then gut flora, of course. So, the more diverse your gut flora is, the more messages of tolerance you actually create on the gut wall. And that's because your gut flora makes short-chain fatty acids, and short-chain fatty acids actually intervene. If you're having an inflammatory reaction, short-chain fatty acids can cut it off before it gets systemic. So they also induce messages of tolerance, and you need good to do that.
Brilliant.
Whew.
Yeah, and I think that makes a lot of sense when we think of how common some sort of food reaction is when we listen to our clients, and they're aware that something's not quite right there. And if we think about just secretory IgA, I really see that. I would say 75% of the time in stool testing, it's low.
Yeah.
And when you think of nutrient deficiencies, some sort of bacterial dysbiosis, and stress being just three things that impact it, it makes sense. But I think the liver part's really interesting. I wasn't aware of that. And again, I assume if these can all be interrelated, because low secretory IgA is almost I think an indirect marker from an intestinal permeability perspective, which is then going to influence liver function as well.
Exactly. Your liver and your gut are essentially the same organ. They're so interconnected to each other that anything that's having a negative impact on one is going to directly have a negative impact on the other. Inflammation in one equals inflammation in the other. Toxic load in one equals toxic load in the other. That hepatic portal vein and the bile are really like snakes and ladders. There's literally, you go up the ladder and then you come down the chute.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like that. Okay, so I guess we've mentioned that to try and start the process, we're always going to be thinking about potentially stool testing to understand the environment and the ecosystem of the gut, and maybe some sort of food reactivity test, if I go with a very general term. Yeah. Are you happy to discuss some of the specific tests that you might be going into from that perspective and beyond as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So am I allowed to mention brand names? Yeah,
pretty sure.
I guess it's not a sponsored podcast.
No, we'll go for it.
So disclosure, I guess, is that I don't work for Cyrex, but I have been employed by the company that brings Cyrex testing into the UK. And what that actually means, I don't make any money off selling the tests or anything like that, but it means I've been in this position of learning about autoimmune reactivity testing almost before, as tests are released, I get an in-depth immersion into what it all means. So Cyrex are an autoimmune research lab and they do a group of tests around understanding autoimmune disease. So they started off, this sort of flagship test was one looking at gluten reactivity and taking it a little bit further than just the celiac disease test, which was what was available before. To understanding that inflammatory reactions can happen to different parts of wheat, not just that one gluten protein that's tested for in celiac disease. And they released that, I want to say it must have been 2013, December 2013 maybe. And then, so 2014, 2015, they launched a couple more tests. And when they brought out the one that I'm going to talk about now, which is ARO10, when I was learning about ARO10, I was like, okay, when I stood up to give the lecture teaching about ARO10, I think one of my opening statements was, okay, guys, this is slightly blowing my mind, this test, because it means we have to think about the relationship with food reactions and autoimmune disease completely different. You know, I think that this moment in time, like the medical literature that I was reading that this test was kind of had been born from, is the beginning of the demarcation between the old way of thinking about food and autoimmune disease and the new way, right? And at that time, I didn't know what was coming because, of course, nothing is discussed until it's published. But I was like, this test and the way that we think about food reactions in autoimmune disease are the new frontier, right? It's a sort of herald what's coming.
Okay.
Is that you?
Yeah. It's going to be a sales call because no one calls the landline, so it should stop any second. There we go. Sorry about that.
That's all right. You're just going to edit this bit out, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Maybe leave it in for some humour.
I'm going to take mine off the hook because my landline number, my office landline number, used to be the number of a company. And the company went under. I had to Google them to find out who this blinking company was. Because I was getting, in the beginning, I've had it for 2 years now, but in the beginning, I was getting like 5 calls a day.
Oh my God.
So I still get like 2 or 3 a week. It's the only time the phone rings. If it's not a tech support call, it's someone looking for this company. Anyway. So with all of my autoimmune patients, at a certain point, I'm going to be using Cyrex ARO10 on them. And I'm looking for specific, like antibody-specific, so immune-mediated reactions to foods. And Cyrex looks at IgA and IgG. It's the only test available to us that looks at IgA, and I think that that's important because, at this moment in time anyway, I think that's important because IgA is it's the part of the immune system involved in autoimmune disease.
Okay.
Cyrex also looks at foods. It tests foods in the form that it's eaten. So, for example, if you're doing a general food reactivity test that looks at pork, it's going to be looking at raw pork, and nobody eats raw pork. And we know that when we heat a food protein, that it changes the protein, and we also know, and you and I have discussed, that when you change a protein, it looks different to the immune system. So if you crack an egg into a bowl and you understand what that looks like, the quote-unquote white is clear and the yolk is runny. But the longer you cook the egg for, those proteins visually look different. They're not runny anymore. They're now solid. After a certain point, the white goes from clear to white. The yolk goes from yellow to green after a certain amount of time, right? So you can visually see that looks different. That's also going to look different to the immune system. So I think it's important to be testing foods in the way that they're eaten. You know, if you eat chicken cooked, you need to test it cooked. Don't test it raw. With something like salmon, where you might be eating salmon sushi or salmon sashimi, which is raw, and you also might be eating it cooked, then that food needs to be tested twice, once in its raw form and once in its cooked form, to understand really if you're reacting yes or no and under what circumstances you're reacting. So I like that Cyrex does that. The other reason that I think it's important to understand IgA and IgG antibody reactions to foods specific to autoimmune disease is because food proteins and tissue proteins can cross-react with each other. So when you are having an immune reaction to a food, you're not actually having an immune reaction to a whole food. You're having an immune reaction to just a small part of the food protein. And because that's a small part of the food protein, that can actually look, that small part, that amino acid sequence, can look very similar to an amino acid sequence in the body. So, for example, gluten cross-reacts with, and that's called cross-reactivity, when two proteins look so similar to each other that the immune system can react to either of them using the same mechanism, right? That can occur with infections. So infections and body tissue can cross-react with each other. Foods can cross-react with each other. So one food might look like another food, and food can cross-react with the body. So, for example, gluten cross-reacts with cells in the brain called Purkinje cells, which are part of the cerebellum. It's a very strong affinity. You know that there's a protein within the Purkinje cells in the cerebellum of the brain that looks a lot like a piece of gluten. So if you are having an immune reaction to gluten, and you also have symptoms, neurological symptoms that are relative to the cerebellum of the brain, which is involved in balance, for example, then one of the mechanisms is that you're eating gluten, but your body is attacking the brain because it's having that cross reaction. And what we now understand about autoimmune disease is that cross-reaction is fairly common. So, and it can happen to any food, okay? It's not specific to just the foods that we consider bad guys, right? So gluten is considered generally to be a bad guy. It's one of the usual suspects. It's Kevin Spacey, in this scenario. But you can be having a cross-reactive inflammatory reaction to salmon or to prawns or to spinach, foods that are allowed, in fact encouraged, on a healing diet. You can be having cross-reactivity to turmeric, which is a widely used anti-inflammatory agent in autoimmune disease. So as for me, you need to test, don't guess, because if you're having an immune-mediated reaction to a food, we don't have enough information at this moment in time to tell us that you're not also having an immune-mediated reaction to the tissue in your body as a direct result of having an immune-mediated response to that food. So there is a really interesting paper looking at thyroid autoimmunity in food. It's the first of its kind. And it opens the door for a lot more research, I think, so that we can really identify when foods cross-react to which tissues in the body and when we need to really be thinking about this in a more specific way. At this moment in time, the only data that we have to make that decision in clinic is immune reactivity to food. We don't have the corresponding information about which foods and which tissues interact with each other. So I think that given what we know and how limited that is at the moment, understanding immune reactivity to food is really important. So that's so stool, looking at the gut, stool analysis, or organic acids, because I do also look at the gut that way. And I like to use organic acids because stool does primarily focus on what's going on in the bowel. And there's a lot of reasons that that's important, and looking at digestive markers and bile and secretory IgA and inflammatory markers and all of that with the stool test is really important for understanding what's going on with tolerance. But I do also like organic acids because it helps us to understand nutrient status and neurotransmitter status and things that are also very important relative to the gut and the immune system. So I consider those. And then I'm also looking for toxins and infections because foods can cross-react with infection. So for example, if you've done a food reactivity panel on somebody and they've come up with a massive reaction to something that they never eat. For example, they're a vegetarian or a vegan and they've reacted to chicken and salmon. That doesn't happen for no reason. It's not that the test is faulty. It's because there is an antibody in that person's system that looks like that food. And that is usually, it's either, like I said, with cross-reactivity, it's either another food. So the foods can cross-react to each other. There was a really good paper that showed some of the it wasn't a Vojdani or Karazian paper, it was a different one from a few years ago that really showed the relationships between different foods and food cross-reactivity, but it can also be an infection. So if somebody's coming up with something like okra, then I'm thinking a gut infection or Epstein-Barr virus. So I also want to be thinking about infections and toxins, depending on somebody's history. You know, when I'm looking at food reactivity, especially if somebody has multiple food reactions, you know, if they're reacting to 100 out of 180 foods, there's got to be, their tolerance is broken, and there's got to be more to it from an immunological perspective than just, you know, a bit of leaky gut and maybe some dysbiosis.
Right.
So chemicals are a really big one. So that person might have breast implants. That person might have a lot of mercury toxicity. That person might have, so for example, there was another paper that looked at medications used in dental procedures triggering loss of oral tolerance and food reactions. What else? There was another paper that looked at perinatal exposure to BPA alters oral tolerance and immunization to dietary antigens. So exposure in the womb creates food intolerances later in life to BPA specifically in that paper. So,
amazing.
Yeah. So that's, I mean, that's my thinking with autoimmune disease in general anyway, right? I'm always doing blood chemistry because I want to be optimizing as many variables as I possibly can, stool and organic acids to look at what's going on in the gut, RA10 from Cyrex to have a look at specific reactions to foods, toxins and infections.
And I think what you mentioned around foods potentially cross-reacting with one another or with infections is just worth emphasizing, because obviously one of the big criticisms that often is used in food sensitivity, food intolerance testing is the high false positive rate.
Yeah.
And how if you've never eaten the food then it's not a problem for you, but actually it's just that maybe we haven't really understood the mechanisms behind how that can occur.
Exactly.
And that's huge.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's a really important thing to understand, because again, our response is usually, but I haven't eaten celery, how could I possibly be reacting to celery? The test must be wrong, instead of trying to understand more about the immunological mechanism that makes that possible. And, you know, with autoimmune disease, one of the issues that happens, of course, is when you have broken tolerance, you react to everything. You know, you're not tolerating your environment anymore. So you're reacting to lots of foods and lots of environmental chemicals and lots of infectious agents, which can be things that are supposed to be living in harmony in your body. They shouldn't be a problem for you, but you've lost tolerance, and so now they are. But so what do you do, right? It's one of the big questions.
Yeah.
People ask me is, okay, if somebody's reacting to 150 out of 180 foods, you can't take all of those foods away. If food diversity is such a big important part of establishing and maintaining tolerance, but somebody's reacting to everything, I mean, how do you even start? You know, so the way that you start, you can't take somebody off all of the foods that they're reacting to immunologically. You know, you can't have somebody living just on 7 foods, and people do. They do that. Yeah. You know, people do that to themselves, and you know, out of desperation, especially when they're really suffering. That's such a normal human response to that situation, but it's more complicated than that. In that instance, you maybe don't even work with the food. You take out the things that are generally inflammatory. I wouldn't be having that person eat a bag of Haribo and a couple of cans of Coke a day. I would probably be taking out the top allergens: gluten, dairy, soy, corn, eggs. But really what you need to do is work on tolerance, right? You have to be working on the immune system and supporting reduction of inflammation in the body and restoration of the mechanisms involved. You know, you have to kind of rehabilitate the liver, and you have to rehabilitate those dendritic cells, and, you know, try to calm down the messaging before you can really establish what the triggers are in that person.
Yeah, and I think that's really helpful, because I know I've certainly had little battles in my mind with that sort of client. And I think, obviously, logically, especially if you don't have any training, it makes sense to just remove foods that you're reacting to. But I've always been, I guess, mindful that by doing that, and what you're doing to the microbiome and the diversity in the ecosystem there, is actually probably then driving why people just get more and more reactive.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And that's something that I've seen again and again and again in my practice, is that people put themselves on a diet that makes sense, right? Because they're inflamed and they've got really bad symptoms and they're in pain and they're afraid. And they've read about a diet on the internet that's very restrictive, and they've put themselves on the diet and their symptoms immediately went down, right? And they had relief from their symptoms for the first time in years. But because they didn't actually do anything to rectify tolerance, they then further continued to lose tolerance. So now they're reacting to foods. They can't reintroduce foods that they used to think that they ate fine. They took them out because it was part of the diet, and they wanted to do the diet perfectly so that they could get better. But then because tolerance is broken, when you try to reintroduce another food, you're likely to be reacting to that food now. And you're probably lost tolerance to some of the new foods that you've introduced, or to the foods that you're now eating more of because you weren't eating them so much before. You haven't rehabilitated the gut microbiome necessarily, and a really restricted diet from a tolerance perspective is not ideal. It's very difficult to rehabilitate someone's immune system. But it's such a normal, if you're listening to this and that's what you've done, it's such a normal response to desperately needing some resolution of symptoms, so it's something that I've seen again and again in practice, and then the diet just gets smaller and smaller, and then we start to see fear around food.
Yes.
One of the biggest mediators of stress is a sense of not being in control, right? And part of not being in control is not knowing when a symptom is going to occur from a food perspective. So if you eat something on one day and you feel okay, and then you eat the same meal the next week and you have a big reaction to it and you have symptoms as a result of that, right? The sense of, I don't know why this is happening and I don't know when it's going to happen, creates a lot of fears and a lot of phobias and a lot of stress around food. And a restrictive diet, a very restricted diet, of course, also sets up a lot of it can set up a very comfortable sense of I am in control, and I'm going to eat these 7 foods come hell or high water, and only those, because in this way I have control over my body. But it can also make you feel like you're in a food prison. The other hand of that, of course, is that you lose a lot of pleasure and a lot of psycho-emotional joy around food, especially as it relates to social situations and family and Christmas and all of that stuff.
Absolutely. And it's so right around what you say about just the opposing way it can go in regards to how people view it. Very kind of empowering, or it creates stress. And some people are going to be so bored with this next point because I mentioned this book quite a lot, but there's a book called Well Stressed by, I think it's Sonia Lupian, and I think she's at somewhere like Harvard. She's got a PhD in stress physiology, and through her research she's come up with the acronym of NUTS. Just novelty, unpredictability, threat to identity, and sense of low control. And it was one of those books that I've read a couple of times because it so resonated, especially from someone going through their health journey, which is, at the beginning it's novel. Yeah. It's often unpredictable throughout the journey. There's often a threat to our identities, especially when we're talking about some of these chronic conditions. So I've worked with quite a lot of clients from a CFS perspective, and obviously they're often very successful at school, in academia, or sport, or both, or they're highly successful in business, and it might be that they're now bedbound for some of the day. And there's a sense of low control, partly because of all of the aforementioned things, but also because they just don't have the knowledge they need. So they do these logical things of the restricted diets, and get some improvement, but then seem to get stuck a little bit as well. And it just really resonated with this idea that, that's just so true from a health perspective. And we need to be really mindful of that. And the final piece of that is, through her research, we all have one or two that are very dominant in us. So some people will be incredibly stressed in new environments, for example, whereas others will just thrive. So again, it comes back to this idea of self-awareness. And I said, I think in a previous podcast, that part of me, and it's going to be obviously different by each case and condition, but at least with some of my clients, the nutrition is the least important part of what's going on here. Their relationship with their food is probably influencing part of why they're reacting to the food in the first place. And then it's a tricky place to get out of, and I've certainly been there to some degree through my health journey anyway.